Welcome back to Desperate Living, where it's time to take a look at another new disc that has come my way. This time an unexpected title that you might not have thought was on anyone's list for 4K restoration. But as with many critically maligned films, Barb Wire might not be what you're led to think it is. Film critics, at least mainstream film critics, tend to be pack animals. With a few notable exceptions, they have something of a hive mind, all agreeing more or less on which films are classics and which films are terrible. This opinion is often cemented when a movie is first released and stays that way afterwards, with new generations lazily parroting the opinions of their predecessors about films that they often haven't even watched, or if they have done so through crap-tinted glasses, expecting awfulness and so finding it. It's curious because what makes a film good or bad is pretty subjective. Film writers might claim otherwise, but it really is down to taste rather than things like the directing, acting, screenplay or technical qualities. That and the idea of a film fulfilling its remit. A comedy needs to be funny, an action movie exciting, a horror film scary or unsettling. And if it's made as escapist entertainment, then it has to be judged on that level. There are several films that I've watched and wondered what the hell the critics were missing when they laid into them so ferociously. We've already discussed Caligula, a personal favourite of mine that even now has so few defenders that a half-baked inferior reworking of the material has been hailed as a long overdue restoration of artistic vision, so keen are people to dismiss the original film. Even more so, Showgirls is a film that's now found cult status after years of critical contempt, but still very much only on the level of so bad it's good for the most part. I'll defend Showgirls to the death as a masterpiece, and the criticism of that film often felt like a deliberate misinterpretation of the movie by people offended by its very concept. I'll be discussing Showgirls in depth in a later video, so gird your loins for that one. And then we come to Barb Wire. You might have raised your eyebrows at the very idea of a UHD edition of Barb Wire. Perhaps not if you're watching this video, because that does suggest a degree of interest in the movie, or else a fascination with what I might have to say about it. We'll get to my opinions in a little bit, but let's first of all have a quick look at the new disc from Altitude. So here's the new UHD edition of Barb Wire, released in the UK. As you can see, it's a fairly standard package. Those of you who think that these things should always come with a slipcase or a steelbook or whatever else will be disappointed, but you know, it's what's inside that counts, I suppose. Inside here we have the single disc. There isn't a UHD Blu-ray combo, but it does have a dual-sided cover, the I guess you call classic artwork, the most famous artwork on the front, and an alternative version that you can choose on the back if you so wish. The disc has quite a few bonus features, an interview with the producer Todd Meyer, costume designer Rosanna Norton, and visual effects supervisor Chris Brown, which are what they are. There's vintage making of and a promotional featurette, again from the time that the film was originally released, and several trailers. Maybe the most significant extra in terms of the film's reputation and its star is 9 minutes worth of the opening sequence, striptease, burlesque, how would you describe it? If you've seen the film, you know what I mean. 9 minutes essentially of a topless Pamela Anderson being hosed down. If that kind of thing floats your boat, then you'll certainly be in the market for this. So this is a fairly standard edition as far as UHD collector editions go, but of course what's important is the movie itself. So let's have a talk about that. So Barb Wire was a comic book adaptation at a time when such things were still rather novel, and like many of its contemporaries in the 90s like The Crow, it was pitched at an adult audience. It was also a vehicle for Baywatch star and Playboy playmate Pamela Anderson, and that was part of its problem. Film critics in 1996 were not inclined to take comic book movies or Pamela Anderson particularly seriously. Add to that the fact that Barb Wire was sold very much on Anderson's cleavage, and you can see why this was never going to have good reviews. Caligula, Showgirls, Barb Wire, all films sold, however inaccurately in the latter case, on sex. Film critics tend to be very suspicious and dismissive of celluloid sex, lest seems like they're finding it titillating. Sex on screen is usually only approved of if it's dour, depressing, and laced with moral disgust. Now, before we go any further, I'm not for a moment suggesting that Barb Wire is a lost masterpiece. It's not on the level of the other two films I've just mentioned, not remotely. And to be fair, it's a very different sort of film, one that's more cartoonish than erotic. It gets most of the TNA out of the way straight away during the notorious opening titles, satisfying the people who came for that, but it also sets up perhaps a false expectation of what the film is. Famously, Barb Wire lifts its plot from Casablanca, transposing the World War II drama to the distant future of 2017, when America is in the midst of a civil war with a dictatorial government, whose agents all dress like Nazis, that has seized control, leaving just one free city standing. This was all fantastical stuff in 1996, but looking at divided America since 2016, it feels a lot more prescient. Barb is a club owner and bounty hunter who gets caught up in a plot to steal contact lenses that contain some secret formula or other that a resistance scientist, who holds the cure to an extra lethal strain of government-engineered HIV in her DNA, needs to get hold of. It's all a bit confused as the film was thrown together piecemeal and only bears a passing similarity to the comic book that it was based on. To be fair, it's got a stronger and more coherent narrative than most Marvel movies, but this isn't really a film that you watch for its complex storyline. Barb Wire feels more like a comic book movie than most other comic book movies. Not just an American comic book movie, it instead has quite a bit of the vibe, the outrageousness and the mix of sex and violence that drove European comic book films. This perhaps belongs to the same universe that brought us things like Barbarella, Diabolic, Satanic, Gwendolyn and Baba Yaga. It's also part of that 1980s and 1990s collection of sci-fi fantasy films with scantily clad kick-ass female protagonists, many of which were also hated by the critics. Red Sonja, Sybil Danning in Battle Beyond the Stars, Galaxina, Sheena, and so on. Movies that again had a comic book edge and cartoonish characters that didn't try to be anything that they weren't. The film also has that great 1990s cyberpunk alternative vibe that we've long since lost. A pumping industrial metal and punk soundtrack, bars that look like fetish clubs, and moody lighting. It's a reminder that movies like this used to be cool, edgy and sexy rather than the po-faced affairs that they are now. It's big, loud, fast-paced and outrageous, with impressive physical effects and stunt scenes that show up just how dreadful modern CGI-dominated superhero cinema is in comparison. There's a physicality here that you just don't see in movies anymore. I do wish that Adam Rifkin had remained as director, especially if he was taking the film in an outlandish, Russ Meyer-inspired direction, as has been claimed. I think that would have absolutely been the right move for the material and for the star, though it seems that Pamela Anderson Lee, as she's credited here, she was still married to Tommy Lee at the time, had a bit of a contradictory attitude towards nudity during the film's production, happy to do the extended sequence where she dances topless on a trapeze while being hosed down that appears briefly and infamously in the opening titles, and, for those of you interested, is included as a 9-minute extra on the disc. But seemingly she was reluctant to allow the film to be as raunchy as it perhaps needs to be. As it is, Barb Wire is more tease than titillation, with her boobs front and centre at all time, but covered, barely, admittedly, by leather and latex outfits. It's easy to scoff at or condemn this film for its fixation on Anderson's body, but is that really so odd? Let's not pretend that the male action stars of the 1980s and beyond were not also sold on their larger-than-life physiques rather than any acting ability. In our rush to find sexism, we tend to forget that the action movie stars of the era were almost all absurdly cartoonish figures. And if you think that the likes of Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone were not sexualized, I suggest taking another look at those movies. Of course, Pamela Anderson wasn't an actor, not really. Or at least she wasn't the kind of hard-assed performer who could pull off the cynical, world-weary character dialogue that she has to speak here. She's got a monotone delivery that's not entirely awful, but perhaps needs more emotion to it, and she appears to be taking it all a bit more seriously than is necessary. It does seem that director David Hogan, more used to music videos and second-unit action movie scenes, was not an actor's director. Again, the film really needed someone like Rifkin to bring it all together. By all accounts, the actors were not directed at all, so perhaps we shouldn't be too harsh on Anderson. She was employed because of who she was and for her physical attributes, and that's also why the film got made. So complaining about her performance seems to be rather missing the point, especially when she's no worse than any of the male action movie stars of the era. No one complained about Schwarzenegger, Stallone, Van Damme or Seagal being one-dimensional in their movies, and if they did, they were probably missing the point, just as they are here. If you watch Barb Wire expecting an acting masterclass, more fool you. It's a bit like complaining that Ken Loach films don't have enough explosions. And the supporting cast is great, and everyone seems to be having fun. Udo Kier is on record of saying how much he enjoyed making this and loved Pamela Anderson, and he's great as usual, while Xander Berkeley, Clint Howard, Nicholas Worth and Steve Railsback all play it very tongue-in-cheek. Railsback, of course, was also in Life Force, another fantastic film that the critics hated. Perhaps again because it had too much nudity. You can see the pattern here. Now look, once again, I'm not saying that Barb Wire is a great film, but it's great entertainment, and maybe that's the only criteria that it needs to fill. It works as what it is, and for the life of me I can never understand why films like this are dismissed while other movies are praised to the sky despite being the same sort of thing, only done less well. This is fast food cinema, but that's fine. It isn't pretending to be anything else. In the grand scheme of things, it's throwaway and fairly forgettable, but I've seen a lot of genuinely awful, boring sci-fi action cinema, and this isn't that. The film needs to be more outrageous, but it's solidly entertaining. Those people who say it's one of the worst films ever made need to give their heads a wobble and perhaps watch more movies. Notably, it was nominated for several Razzies and is on a list of the 20 worst films ever made by the defunct website The Stinkers, a list that notably only seems to contain films the 1980s and 1990s, which suggests that the idiot voters were unfamiliar with movies from earlier decades. I hope I don't need to tell you that these smug worst film awards are moronic, cynical exercises in snobbery from the sort of no-talent hacks who are wrong about everything all the time, and that anything that they sneer at is sure to be worth a look. So do you need this disc? Well, no. But should you pick it up anyway? I'm going to say yes. Time has been kinder to this than you might expect, and what might have felt generic at the time now feels pretty edgy and daring. I mildly enjoyed it when it first came out, and I enjoyed it a lot more watching it again on this edition. It's big, brash, noisy and dumb, and sometimes that's what you need. The new UHD looks fantastic, sounds great, and is perfect escapism. It's the sort of thing that works well on a big screen with the sound cranked up and your brain switched off. If modern superhero movies could get back to this sense of unpretentious comic book fun, I might have more time for the genre. And before we finish, I've never actually read one of the Barb Wire comic books, so I can't really compare it to the movie. I know that they're very different. I do, however, have the Barb Wire tie-in novelisation, which is one of those novelisations that's probably a little bit better than the film itself, in that your imagination can get to work on this one, and it allows you to maybe fill in some of the shoddier aspects of the film into something more effective. So definitely worth picking up if you ever find a copy. Obviously it's very old and it's never been reprinted as far as I'm aware, but well worth a look. If you've made it this far, well done. You obviously like this sort of thing, or else have a kind of masochistic streak that's made you rage watch all the way to the end. But either way, you should probably subscribe, like, hit the alert bell, share with friends, and let us know in the comments what you think of the movie. Every interaction, even the negative ones from our regular haters, helps build the channel and move us forward. And don't forget to check out our new dedicated review channel linked below and above, where classic and not so classic films are covered in depth. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.